In the heart of Alabama's backwoods, there are stories the soil itself seems unwilling to let go. Stories whispered through generations, never written, never confessed, only passed from mouth to trembling mouth when the fire burned low. One story in particular has haunted the hills, a tale of a groom whose bride was not a stranger, nor a distant cousin, but the girl who had shared his blood since the cradle, a brother who married his own sister. The people who lived near them called it sin, others called it survival, but most never dared to call it anything at all, for to speak it aloud was to bring the curse closer, to invite the rot into your own family tree, and yet here we are staring directly into the truth that Alabama itself has tried to bury beneath dirt, pine roots and silence. He was not the first in his line, and he would not be the last. The boy who became the groom was born in a shack that leaned like it was too tired to stand. His father was his mother's cousin. His grandfather had been something worse, and by the time he came into the world, the blood had already folded in on itself too many times to count. His face bore the proof. One eye turned slightly inward, a jaw that never grew straight, a frame too narrow for a man. But he was still considered lucky by his family because he lived past infancy. Many of his siblings never did. The dirt around that shack carried more tiny graves than it did flowers. The land was isolated, the people poor, the world outside unforgiving. Education never reached their hollow, doctors never stepped foot inside. And so the family survived by its own rules, rules that bent and twisted with every generation. Blood was not something to be protected, it was something to be recycled, folded back into itself like an old quilt that had lost all its shape. Outsiders didn't come near, and the few who tried left quickly, disturbed by what they saw in the faces staring back at them. Eyes too close together, mouths too small, voices that slurred and stumbled like a child learning to speak. In those hills, this wasn't abnormal. This was heritage. But the wedding, his wedding, became the story that lived on in whispers. He was 16 when he took his sister as his bride. She was barely 13. The family called it natural, inevitable, even righteous. To them, it was no different than planting seed back in the same soil year after year, hoping the crop would grow strong despite the rot underneath. But to those who caught word of it from the nearby towns, it was proof of the darkness festering in the hills, proof that something inside Alabama's forgotten families was eating itself alive. The day of the wedding was no celebration. There were no flowers, no music, no preacher in a pressed suit, just a clearing behind the shack, a rusted tin plate of cornbread, and a family gathered in silence. The bride wore a hand-me-down dress once used by their mother, its hem torn and its lace yellow with age. The groom wore nothing more than patched trousers and a shirt that smelled of smoke. The family didn't clap, they didn't cheer. They stood and watched, their faces like masks, as though they had seen it all before and would see it again, because they had. It wasn't a ceremony meant for joy, it was a ritual of survival, bound not by faith, but by fear. Fear of outsiders, fear of bloodlines ending, fear of the shame that would come if anyone knew just how many generations had been folded into one. The words spoken were few. A father's voice muttering approval, a mother's cracked hands placing them together, and silence swallowing the rest. That silence said more than words ever could. This was not a choice, this was destiny, sealed by dirt, hunger, and isolation. Neighbors, those who heard pieces of the tale through rumor, pretended not to. A store clerk in town once whispered that he saw the bride and groom buying supplies, their hands intertwined like children too scared to let go. He swore their eyes had the same shade of pale blue, the same unsettling vacancy. He never spoke it again after that night. People in small towns know when to shut their mouths, not out of mercy but out of fear of becoming tangled in someone else's curse. But it wasn't just the wedding that unsettled people. It was the children that came after. Each one a reminder, each one carrying the burden of blood that had no place to go but back into itself. Some were born silent, wrapped in blankets that were buried before dawn. Others lived, their features carved by generations of callappi. Foreheads swollen, eyes misaligned, jaws too weak to chew. The family called them blessings. Outsiders called them abominations. And the truth, the haunting truth, is that both were right. And yet through it all, the brother groom and sister bride remained bound together, not by love, not by passion, but by the unspoken rule of their land. In those hills, family was not just everything, it was the only thing. Even if that family tree grew twisted, gnarled, and black with rot, they clung to it as though letting go meant death itself. As the years passed, their names slipped from memory, but their story never did. Folklore has a way of holding on to the grotesque, and this tale was no different. In hushed voices, elders spoke of the brother and sister as though they were cautionary ghosts, proof of what happens when isolation becomes a cage. Their shack, leaning in on itself deeper with every storm, became a landmark for whispers. Children walking home from school pointed at it from afar, daring each other to step closer. Parents warned them not to, because some believed the land itself was cursed, poisoned by the sins that had taken root there. But curses don't start in the soil, they start in choices, and the choices made in that family were never really choices at all. Poverty twisted their hands, hunger narrowed their world. Religion abandoned them, or maybe they abandoned it. Whatever the truth, they became a clan that obeyed only its own rules. A world within a world, hidden in the shadows of Alabama's forests, where blood became both chain and coffin. Travelers who stumbled near the shack described hearing voices inside that didn't sound entirely human. Words tangled, slurred, warped like echoes bouncing against broken walls. Some said the family avoided the sunlight, stepping out only when the moon rose, their movements slow, their gazes vacant. Others swore that when they looked into the eyes of the bride-turned-mother, they felt something unnatural, an emptiness, like staring into a reflection that wasn't quite right. And still, no one dared to intervene, because in small towns, sins are not erased, they are simply ignored until they rot quietly, out of sight. But folklore doesn't ignore, it sharpens, it remembers, and as the brother and sister's children grew, so did the unease. Rumors spread that some of the children never spoke a word in their lives, that others howled through the night, as though something ancient inside them was clawing to get out. A midwife who once tended to the family left town soon after, refusing to say why. The silence she carried with her was louder than any story she might have told. So the tale of the inbred groom and his sister bride was passed down, not as history, but as warning. A reminder that in the forgotten hollows of Alabama, where the map fades and the pine trees crowd too close, there are truths too dark to speak and families who paid the price for daring to ignore them. Generations blurred together in that shack, like names smudged from a gravestone. The brother groom grew older, but not wiser, his body thin and bent long before its time. His sister bride, worn down by childbirth, carried the look of someone twice her age by the time she reached her 30s. Their children, some surviving, some buried in shallow graves behind the house, became the proof of what happens when a family tree folds back into itself. Each face carried echoes of the same deformities, eyes that refused to align, foreheads that bulged unnaturally, limbs that trembled with weakness. Neighbors from nearby hollows spoke of the children appearing in town on rare occasions, led by their parents like shadows clinging to shadows. They moved quietly, but their presence never was. People looked away, ashamed to stare, but unable to forget. The store clerks remembered their slurred words, the way their mouths struggled to form sentences, the way their hands twitched as though guided by nerves that didn't work properly. One man said he couldn't shake the memory of a boy whose face seemed too symmetrical in one place and not at all in another, like God himself had lost patience while shaping him. And yet, for all their difference, the family was united by a stubbornness no deformity could break. They clung to the land, no matter how barren, no matter how cursed. Outsiders might have fled, started over elsewhere, but not them. For them, leaving was unthinkable. Their entire lives were rooted in that soil, poisoned though it was. To leave would be to admit their way of life was wrong, and for a family raised to believe blood was both bond and salvation, wrong was a word that never took root. The brother Groom was known to say in the rare moments he spoke with others that the world outside his hollow wasn't meant for his kind, that they were better off keeping to themselves. Elves, tending to their own, marrying their own. He believed it wasn't sin, it was survival, and in that twisted belief lay the seed of their downfall. For the children born of brother and sister grew into adults who repeated the cycle. Some brothers took their sisters, some fathers claimed their daughters. The lines blurred so deeply that by the third generation, no one in that shack could truly say where one bloodline ended and another began. They became a loop with no escape, trapped in a family tree that had long since stopped growing and only circled itself like a snake devouring its own tail. By the mid-1900s, the whispers had traveled far beyond the hollow. The tale of Alabama's inbred groom and his sister bride became more than just rumor. It turned into legend, carried by truck drivers, preachers, and drifters who passed through and left unsettled. Some spoke of it with pity, others with disgust, but all with the same uneasy fascination. It was no longer just a story about one family. It was about what happens when isolation festers into something unrecognizable. The shack itself became an unholy landmark. Locals claimed you could hear cries from its walls at night, not quite human, not quite animal. Wind slipped through its warped boards like voices whispering secrets too shameful to be heard in daylight. Teenagers dared each other to creep close, but most never made it past the tree line. Those who did swore the place carried a heaviness, like the earth itself remembered what had been done there. And perhaps it did, because the land around the home never grew right. The grass came in patchy, the trees leaned crooked, as though the soil itself bore the memory of what had been buried in it. But the most haunting detail is this: no one ever tried to stop it. Authorities never intervened, neighbors never spoke up. Ministers looked the other way. In the silence of the South, sins that fester in the shadows are left to devour themselves. And so the family line continued, year after year, children born into a cycle no one dared to break. It became less about ignorance and more about choice, not their choice, but the choice of everyone who knew and refused to act. By the time the groom grew old, his body wasted and frail, the children he had fathered with his sister were already raising families of their own. The pattern had taken root so deep that it was no longer just his sin, but his legacy. He became less a man and more a symbol, a warning wrapped in flesh. And when he finally died, the land did not mourn. There was no grave marker, no sermon, no hymn, just another mound of dirt among dozens behind the shack, where blood returned to soil and silence swallowed the rest. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed loyal to the only world you'd ever known, or broken free and carried the curse into the open air? But breaking free was never simple. Those born into that family didn't carry just the weight of blood, they carried the weight of shame. By the 1970s, local folklore had blurred fact and fiction so tightly that even historians struggled to tell the difference. Some claimed the shack still stood, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under decades of storms. Others swore it had burned down in a fire no one could explain, as though the land itself had tried to erase the evidence. Yet no matter what became of the building, the story lived on. Because stories like this never die, they haunt. The children and grandchildren of the brother groom and sister bride carried the same faces, the same traits, the same slurred voices that betrayed their blood. In towns across Alabama, people whispered when they saw them, quick to look away, quicker still to pretend they hadn't noticed. Some of the descendants tried to live quietly, working odd jobs, keeping their heads low. Others disappeared entirely, swallowed by the woods, their names lost like wind through the pines. But every now and then, someone would speak of them. A farmer recalling a strange man wandering his land, his eyes too close together, his words stumbling. A woman swearing she saw two figures on the edge of her property, standing hand in hand, though they looked far too similar to be strangers. These sightings kept the legend alive, fueling the belief that the curse had never truly ended. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. Because a curse doesn't vanish when a shack collapses or when a name is forgotten. It lingers in blood, carried from parent to child, like a shadow that cannot be outrun. For this family, their legacy was not only carved into their bones, it was etched into the very memory of the land. Alabama itself seemed to remember, holding on to the horror like a scar. When we speak of history, we often think of wars, leaders, and triumphs, but hidden beneath the surface are stories like this, stories too disturbing to be printed in textbooks, stories of families who became their own undoing, and in the case of the most inbred groom who took his sister, the horror lies not just in what they did, but in how easily everyone else looked away. Even now, the story of Alabama's most inbred groom lingers like a sickness you can't name. The shack is gone, the family scattered, but the folklore remains. It is told in fragments, half memory, half nightmare. Old men on porches lean in closer when they tell it, their voices low, their eyes shifting to the trees as if the shadows might still be listening. They say the curse never died. They say blood that twisted so deeply into itself can never truly be washed away. Somewhere in the veins of Alabama, pieces of that family still walk the earth. And when you think about it long enough, the horror takes a different shape. Because maybe this was never just about one brother and one sister, or about a shack deep in the woods. Maybe it's about what happens when silence protects sin, when shame is hidden instead of confronted, when people decide it is easier to turn their heads than to open their mouths. In that silence, the grotesque is allowed to thrive. In that silence, a family line can eat itself alive. The most unsettling part of the legend is not the deformities, not the children who never spoke, not the graves left unmarked in the dirt. It is the ordinariness of it. A boy who became a groom, a girl who became a bride, a family who told themselves they had no choice, and a community that chose to do nothing. That is where the true darkness lies, in the quiet acceptance of the unbearable. So Alabama keeps its secrets, tucked away in folklore, in warnings told to children, in rumors whispered in gas stations and at kitchen tables. People will argue about what was true, what was embellished, and what was invented outright. But one thing is certain, the story of the groom who married his sister has become more than just a tale. It is a scar, a reminder carved into the cultural memory of the South. And for those who dare to look closer, to peel back the layers of silence. Hence, it asks a question most would rather never face. What do we inherit when the past has rotted? And if blood itself can carry curses, then perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this. Maybe the curse is not theirs alone. Maybe it belongs to all of us, waiting in the quiet, passed down through the stories we're too afraid to tell.